It was the darkest night we'd ever seen. The wind howled like a wild animal, shaking the old houses in our village. I remember it clearly because that was the night everything changed. It was cold, too cold, and the air felt heavy, like something bad was about to happen. I was only 15 at the time, like many of you listening now, still learning what it meant to be brave. But what we faced that night was something none of us could ever prepare for. Our village wasn't big, but it was a happy place. We knew everyone by name and we shared everything: food, stories, laughter. The elders always said our village was blessed because we lived at the foot of a great mountain that protected us from the harsh winds and storms. But that night the mountain couldn't protect us. The trouble started earlier that day, when the sky turned a strange shade of gray, almost like the clouds were made of ash. We had never seen anything like it before. The animals, the ones that usually wandered freely around the village, started behaving strangely too. The chickens refused to leave their coops, and the goats huddled together trembling. My friend Haruna and I were sitting outside his father's house when we noticed the birds. They flew in frantic circles above the trees, like they didn't know where to go. It was unsettling, but we didn't think much of it at the time. We were just kids after all. As the day wore on, the air became colder. By sunset, it was freezing. People began to worry. The elders gathered in the village square to talk about what was happening. They had lived through many seasons, but none of them had ever seen weather like this. My mother told me to stay inside, but I couldn't help sneaking out to see what the elders were saying. "The wind is angry," one of the elders said. His voice shook as he spoke. "I fear the mountain spirit is restless." I didn't know what he meant. We had always believed the mountain protected us, kept us safe. But now, it felt like something was wrong. The cold continued to bite at our skin, and people started lighting fires, more fires than usual, to keep warm. But no matter how close we stood to the flames, the cold didn't go away. And then, just as the last bit of daylight disappeared, the wind came. It wasn't like a normal wind, the kind that whistles gently through the trees. No, this wind roared. It swept down from the mountain like a beast, knocking over anything in its path. I saw roofs torn from houses and trees ripped from the ground. People were screaming, running for cover, but there was nowhere to go. Haruna and I ran toward the village center, where everyone was gathering. My heart pounded in my chest as we fought against the wind, barely able to keep our footing. The sky was pitch black now, and the only light came from the fires people had lit. But even those were being blown out by the fierce wind. Suddenly, a loud cracking sound filled the air. We looked up and saw a massive tree, one that had stood in the village for as long as anyone could remember, swaying dangerously. Before we could react, the tree came crashing down, right into one of the houses. I heard a scream, but the wind was so loud I couldn't tell where it came from. People started shouting names, looking for their loved ones. My mother grabbed my hand and pulled me close, her face pale with fear. "We need to stay together," she said. "We'll get through this if we stay together." The wind didn't let up. It kept roaring through the night, tearing apart the village we had built with our own hands. But something incredible happened in the midst of all the chaos. The people, my people, didn't give up. As houses crumbled, as the wind tore through everything we knew, we came together. We held on to each other, forming chains of arms, pulling the injured to safety, covering the children from the flying debris. I remember seeing Haruna's father standing tall, shouting instructions, organizing the villagers. He was a man of great strength, but I had never seen him like this before. He became our leader that night, guiding us through the storm. The elders too, though frail, didn't falter. They moved from house to house, checking on everyone, making sure no one was left behind. Hours passed and still the wind raged, but we didn't stop fighting. We didn't stop holding on to each other. It was only near dawn, when the first light of day began to peek over the horizon, that the wind finally began to die down. The air was still cold, but the worst had passed. We stood there, bruised, battered, but alive. When the wind stopped completely, we looked around at what was left. Our village was in ruins. Houses had been flattened, trees uprooted, And the once peaceful paths we walked every day were littered with debris. It was hard to believe that this was the same place we had called home just hours before. But as I looked at the people around me, I saw something that filled me with hope. We had survived. Together. The wind had torn apart our homes, but it couldn't tear apart our spirit. Haruna stood next to me, his face smudged with dirt, but his eyes were bright. "We made it," he whispered. Over the next few days, we began to rebuild. It wasn't easy, but we worked side by side just like we had during the storm. The village wasn't the same as it had been before, but in some ways, it was stronger. The storm had shown us what we were capable of, how strong we were when we stood together. The elders told us that the storm was a test, that the mountain spirit had wanted to see if we were worthy of its protection. I didn't know if that was true, but I did know one thing: we had faced something terrible, and we had survived, not because of one person, but because of all of us. And even now, years later, when the wind howls at night, I remember that night. I remember the fear, the cold, the darkness. But most of all, I remember how we came together. How in the face of the worst storm we had ever seen, we found strength in each other.